Welcome back to another Visla Sean. Today, we're tearing into the incredibly chaotic, boundary-pushing, and honestly downright controversial origins of the gaming industry's absolute biggest titan. Look, if you think you already know the full story behind the Grand Theft Auto franchise, I promise you the reality of how this absolute juggernaut actually came to be is way wilder than anything you've played in the games themselves. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's just start right here. $20 crore. That is the estimated revenue Rockstar Games is pulling in every single day, right now, today, just from GTA 5 alone. It's literally the second best-selling video game in the history of the world. We're talking about a cultural phenomenon that practically prints money and completely defines modern entertainment.
But you know, that leads us to a pretty massive mystery. How exactly did a game that was almost permanently canceled, multiple times mind you, a game that actually started off as a, frankly, kind of boring little racing concept, how did that evolve into this 20 crore rupee a day empire? Like, what was the secret sauce that completely flipped the whole industry on its head? Well, to figure that out, we got to travel back in time. Section 1. The Birth of an Empire.
So we have to go all the way back to 1987, to a humble little studio in Scotland called DMA Design. Founded by David Jones and a few of his classmates, this was basically the incubator, the very beginning of the legendary studio that had eventually become Rockstar North. And man, this brilliantly illustrates one of the absolute greatest ironies in all of gaming history. Because before they were making games about, carjackings and crime syndicates, DMA Design was actually famous for a super cute, family-friendly puzzle game from 1991 called Lemmings. It was a massive hit, sold over 50 million copies. Just think about that creative whiplash for a second. The exact same minds that task you with saving those adorable little green-haired creatures eventually went on to create the most violently gritty, controversial crime franchise we've ever seen.
Section 2. The DNA of Rockstar Games. To really understand how that massively even happened, we have to look at creator David Jones's mindset back in 1997. His whole philosophy was crystal clear. He said, "We make games that don't follow trends, but create their own genre." Literally, if a new game idea was pitched at the studio, the very first question out of anyone's mouth was always, what is different about it? They point-blank refused to just churn out standard, linear first-person shooters like everyone else was doing. They wanted to build a completely unique genre heavily focused on open-ended freedom, giving players a true sandbox where they could just go anywhere and do whatever they wanted. That unyielding risk-taking attitude, that right there became the bedrock of the entire franchise.
Tracing their corporate evolution kind of shows us how this all built into the powerhouse we recognize today. So they started out as DMA Design in '87. Fast forward a bit to 1998, and their massive untapped potential catches the eye of Take-Two Interactive, whose subsidiary BMG Interactive ended up buying the studio. Then, following the eventual monumental success of GTA 3, a huge rebranding happened in 2002. BMG was formally renamed Rockstar Games, and those original Scottish developers, DMA Design, officially became Rockstar North. The name on the building changed, sure, but that foundational philosophy of total, unapologetic creative freedom, that stayed exactly the same.
Section 3. A troubled 4-year development. All right, let's rewind just slightly to April 1995. This is when the actual development of the first Grand Theft Auto officially kicked off, drawing a ton of inspiration from American crime movies and this highly glorified violent cultural aesthetic. But behind the scenes, it was an absolute mess. The game lacked a clear identity for a really long time. They initially thought, hey, we can wrap this up and ship it by 1996, but nope, it dragged into 4 agonizing years of absolute development hell. The team actually faced multiple threats of the whole project being completely scrapped and canceled by executives who just weren't seeing the vision. Because remember, it started simply as this fast-paced multiplayer car racing concept.
Originally, the idea was essentially just a high-speed game of tag. You could play as the cops, or you could play as the robbers. But here is where the absolute magic happened. The developers quickly realized that playing as the police, following the rules, pulling people over, well, it was just plain boring. So what they do? They completely flipped the script. They decided to let players completely embrace the criminal side, stealing cars, running from the law, causing absolute chaos, and taking jobs from underworld syndicates. It was a total game changer. Once they fully leaned into that criminal element, they started heavily pushing the envelope. They added rival gangs fighting in the streets, they let players blow up vehicles with rocket launchers, they even coded this wild mission involving a bomb inside a speeding bus. But, and this is super interesting, even these boundary-pushing developers had their limits. Actually, scratch that. They were bold, but they definitely weren't crazy. See, they built a mission where you had to burn down a church, but they ended up scrapping it at the very last minute.
Why? Because they were genuinely terrified of the massive religious backlash it would inevitably cause.
Section 4. Weaponizing bad PR for sales.
So by 1997, the game is finally finished. But selling this unconventional top-down mess, that required a genuinely devious strategy. Take-Two Interactive knew the traditional marketing playbook just wasn't going to cut it here. Enter their secret weapon, Max Clifford. Clifford was this notorious, utterly ruthless publicist. Take-Two specifically hired him not to highlight the game's cool open-world mechanics, but to intentionally engineer a massive moral panic. Literally, his job was to create fake news and widespread fiery outrage. Now, it's a matter of historical record that Clifford was a deeply controversial figure. He actually ended up going to jail years later in 2014. But at the time, his extreme, unapologetic tactics were exactly what the publishers were looking for.
You might look back and see these furious headlines from papers like the Daily Mail condemning the game as this corrupting menace. But get this, that wasn't organic journalistic outrage. Max Clifford actually planted those exaggerated concepts with the press himself. He aggressively fed the media the narrative that this game was dangerous and completely devoid of morals. It was brilliant, really. He perfectly engineered this forbidden fruit effect, because he knew with absolute certainty that the loudest, most effective way to get gamers to play something is to have angry adults tell them they absolutely shouldn't. He went to astonishing lengths to manufacture this outlaw image. Here's a crazy anecdote about just how far the PR machine actually went. One of the game's developers, Brian Baglow, got into a highly mundane, totally normal real-life car crash. Nothing crazy. But Clifford immediately messaged his contacts at the newspapers and had them run a highly misleading headline claiming the GTA boss was banned from driving. It was complete and utter spin, purely designed to make the creators look like real-life outlaws terrorizing the streets.
And the politicians and governments? Oh, they fell for the trap hook, line, and sinker. The game was universally condemned on a global scale. I mean, actual parliaments were debating it. It was slapped with an 18+ rating, which officially cemented that exact forbidden fruit status Clifford wanted all along. Countries like Britain, Germany, and France are publicly debating its dangers. And Brazil, they just outright banned the game entirely. Clifford had miraculously turned this pixelated, slightly clunky 2D game into public enemy number one.
So what was the result of all that carefully manufactured outrage? Well, it worked flawlessly. By 1998, driven entirely by this massive wave of free, notorious publicity, the game crossed 1 million copies sold. It instantly became a massive commercial hit in the UK. The bad PR was, quite literally, the absolute best marketing campaign money could ever buy.
This deeply engineered rebellion permanently cemented the franchise's legacy in gaming history. Years later, in 2008, the series was officially awarded a Guinness World Record for the most controversial game, citing over 4,000 condemning articles published about it. They built a multi-million-dollar empire squarely on the back of infamy. Kinda genius, right?
Section 5. Expanding the 2D universe. Having clearly established their infamy, the studio then pivoted to focus heavily on immersion. The audio design was just as rebellious and innovative as the gameplay itself, and this is truly where the world began to feel alive. Just 3 dedicated audio developers worked tirelessly, often pulling all-nighters, to create this breathing soundscape. They invented the iconic in-game radio stations, which dynamically changed depending on which zone of the city you were currently driving through. That was an absolute technical marvel at the time. They even allowed players on PC to put in their own custom music CDs to listen to while outrunning the cops. They were transforming the digital city from a simple, static backdrop into an actual, living character. In 1999, they capitalized on all that momentum by releasing expansion packs set in a real-world location, GTA London 1969 and later 1961. Now, these weren't just fun little add-ons. These early 1999 DLCs were the direct prototypes for the massive living worlds we all expect from Rockstar today. They introduced highly specific local British slang, super deep atmospheric touches, and they really refined that iconic mechanic of answering ringing payphones on the street to accept your criminal jobs. That exact same year, they delivered a full-blown sequel with GTA 2, set in this cool retro-futuristic metropolis simply called Anywhere City. The mechanical evolutions here were absolutely crucial. First, you could finally save your progress, ironically, by visiting a church, which is a hilarious nod to their earlier scrapped mission. They also introduced this brilliant respect system with 3 rival crime syndicates, so completing a job for one gang actively made you a target for another. Plus, they populated the world with dynamic side missions, like hopping into a taxi and actually picking up fares. The world was just getting denser, way more reactive, and incredibly addictive.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer, but it leaves us with a truly massive question. We've seen how a clunky, top-down 2D game managed to incite international outrage, government banishment, and rack up incredible sales. But gaming technology was rapidly advancing. So I leave you with this provocative thought. If a simple 2D game caused this much global panic and entirely shifted the gaming industry, what on earth happened when they finally brought this chaotic, criminal universe into fully immersive 3D with GTA 3? Well, that, my friends, is a story for another Vacillation. Thanks so much for joining me today, and stay curious.